On Washington Unplugged, EU Ambassador John Bruton. Our roundtable looks at President Obama's trip to Europe and cartoonist Tom Toles.
Hello, this is Washington Unplugged. I'm John Dickerson in for Bob Schieffer. Next week, President Obama takes his first big foreign trip. He'll visit 5 countries in 8 days, attend the G20 summit, a NATO conference, and meet with the European Union. He's personally popular, but his policies on global stimulus and Afghanistan are being openly resisted. What kind of reception will he get? I'm joined by European Union Ambassador John Bruton, also the former Prime Minister of Ireland. Welcome. I want to ask you this morning about Afghanistan. You were at the White House. What did you hear? What's your reaction to the President's new plan?
Well, I heard clearly that the target is to ensure that Al-Qaeda and terrorism do not prosper in either Afghanistan or in Pakistan, and that the goal is to ensure that that doesn't happen. There isn't perhaps the same ambition in terms of state building and so forth that we might have heard, democracy promotion that we might have heard before, but a determination at the same time to stand behind the duly elected governments of Pakistan and of Afghanistan. Clearly a call for assistance from the rest of the world, from Europe, which will be forthcoming from Europe, to do on the civilian side what's been done on the military side by primarily US troops.
But just the civilian side, no troops.
There may be some additional troops for some purposes, particularly training was mentioned by President Obama, and I have no doubt that we would be willing to provide training for the Afghan army and the Afghan police. The development of the Afghan police is very, very important.
The President said in his remarks, the safety of the people around the world is at stake. That's a pretty broad statement. What's your sense of that?
Well, he backed that up by pointing out to a number of terrorist atrocities in Asia and in Europe, which are linked back to Al-Qaeda, which is based on the Afghan-Pakistan border. And clearly, this is a problem for everybody. There have been differences in the past as to exactly which particular means we should use to deal with it. But there is nobody who will question the President's statement that this terrorist nest represents a problem for the entire world.
So this will be well received in Europe?
Yes, and he emphasized that the vast majority of the victims of Al-Qaeda have been Muslims.
Now, next week we have this extraordinary trip. The President is taking a lot on his plate. How will he be received broadly when he comes to Europe?
Very well. I think Europeans have agreed themselves that we should stimulate our economy, and a number of European countries, those that can afford to do so, have already put stimulus plans in place, and we support the stimulus that's been given by the United States and by China. We also support the efforts that are being taken to recapitalize the banks. In Europe, we're doing it by many cases by nationalization. Here in the United States, it's been done by other methods, and also to remove the toxic assets. That those assets have to be valued and removed from the system so that the financial system can breathe again.
There has been some resistance, though, in France and Germany on the question of stimulus, and then we, of course, had the former Czech Prime Minister saying that the stimulus package was a way to hell. There is, though, some friction on this question of
well, there are different. I mean, we have a Stability and Growth Pact to govern the euro, which imposes very strict limitations on borrowing, which in normal times are absolutely reasonable, but we're not in normal times. But people are having to get used to changing policy very rapidly because the situation is changing very rapidly. Some European countries, notably Germany, have been prepared to go quite far in promoting stimulus. Others, for reasons concerned with the aging of their own populations or their own fiscal positions, are a little bit more cautious.
How will we know that this has been a success, this visit? What's plausible here, and what's the best outcome of this visit?
I think we're going to see, coming from this, commitment to better regulation of the financial system, commitment to substantial increases in funds for the IMF. Because if governments are going to take on the debts of banks, who's going to look after the finances of governments? There has to be somebody to stand behind governments, and the IMF needs more funds so that if governments get into difficulty, they too can get assistance to be tided over.
You were here during the Bush administration. Now you see the new team in town. What are the differences? What have you noticed of the differences?
Well, I think there's a willingness to confront unpleasant facts that's notable in this administration. I was particularly heartened, for example, by what Secretary of State Clinton had to say in the last 2 days about the extent to which consumption of drugs by Americans, and she could have said Europeans as well, is contributing to the problems of law and order in Mexico. And that we must take our responsibility as societies which are consuming illegal drugs for the destabilization that is resulting in countries like Colombia and in Mexico. And I think that will be very much welcomed by people in Latin America, who are very good partners of ours and whom we must assist in every way.
Excellent. Ambassador John Bruton, thank you very much. You're watching Washington Unplugged on CBSNews.com. Welcome back to Washington Unplugged. I'm now joined by CBS News White House correspondent Peter Mayer and Politico.com's editor David Mark. Peter, I can hear the birds in the background there as the president gets ready to take off for Europe. Tell me about the trip and what they're thinking over there about it.
Well, of course, the president's going to be the rookie summiteer, but first among equals at two summits. The first one, the G20 meeting, that'll center on the economy in London early next week. And then later in the week, he's going to go on to Germany and France for the big NATO meeting. Through the years, these summits have often evolved into gabfests and empty agendas, but I can't recall a pair of summits that have been so important in a very long time, perhaps going back to the Soviet era and all of the arms control summits. At that G20 meeting in London, the economy, of course, is going to be front and center. The president under a lot of pressure from the European partners to come up with some firm regulations. He'll be asking them for more economic stimulus, and the markets will be watching it all, and the long-term and short-term investors will be watching it all, and it could really shake the markets depending on whether they have lip service at that session or they come up with something solid.
And then also, well, there's an interesting thing. In Europe, he's quite popular. He's gotten personally popular. He's gotten some pushback on his policies. There's the stimulus, of course, and then there's his announcement today on Afghanistan. How do you think that'll play?
Well, that's going to be interesting. You know, he enjoys very high ratings. In fact, his ratings, his public approval ratings in places like England and France and Germany and other places on the itinerary are actually stronger than they are here, higher than they are here, up in the high 70s and low 80s in some of those places. But there will be some pushback in terms of more troops from those countries to go to Afghanistan. The U.S. increasingly in a go-it-alone position on that. And by the end of the year, there'll be over 60,000 U.S. troops there. And I don't think we're going to see the Europeans commit to additional troops, although England is hinting at it now that they may send a couple thousand more, but the others not likely.
David, there's a lot going on domestically as well. It's sort of funny to have international affairs intrude here. The president had a press conference this week, wasn't really asked any questions about it. Domestically, he started the week trying to pivot from the mess he inherited to the budget he's trying to sell. How do you do this week?
Well, it's a work in progress. Probably the biggest obstacle, the biggest challenge the president faces now is from Democrats on Capitol Hill as much as Republicans. We saw the chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, Kent Conrad, essentially carve up his budget and say, you're not getting all the tax cuts you wanted, the ones you had proposed. We're going to change a bunch of other things. So he's got to deal with his own team as much as the opposition.
That's right. So he got a little pushback from his own team. Then enter the Republicans. In the House, they put forward a budget, and the White House had quite a fun time pointing out that, as Robert Gibbs put it, there were more pictures of windmills in this budget than there were charts of numbers. There was only one picture of a windmill. Tell me the story about that Republican budget.
Well, of course, this is all a bit of a straw man, because in our system of government, it's not the opposition's responsibility to come up with a budget, but you would never know that listening to the White House. It's very politically savvy on that. Having said that, the Republicans kind of bought into this idea of having to put forward an alternative budget. There were some real rifts and splits developing here between House Minority Leader John Boehner, who was kind of fuzzy on the specifics, and some of the other House leaders who had very hard numbers they wanted to put forward. And we saw some internal dissension that was very fascinating to watch.
Peter, what do you think in terms of the president being overseas for this long period, the mix in terms of foreign policy versus domestic policy? Is he now off the stage domestically? Do Republicans have a little room to run here? How are they going to balance that at the White House?
Well, especially at that G20 meeting in London, John, it's going to be a real mix. I mean, these things are all intertwined. The U.S. economy very much on the line in every facet of that meeting. When you talk about more regulation, when you talk about this call for for more stimulus. And there could be some surprises too. The president will be meeting on the sidelines with the leaders of Russia and China and India and South Korea. A lot of trade issues that affect so many parts of the country, the farm belt and any of the industrial sectors. So there's no escaping the challenges, and I'm sure he's the domestic challenges, and I'm sure he's going to also stay very closely attuned to the evolving budget fight that you guys are talking about.
In this budget fight, David, the president is trying a mix of different ways to talk to the American people. This week he held an online town hall, the first time ever for a president. A little bit of a gimmick, but also it was sort of successful. What's your sense of how successful he's been, both going over the filter, the news filter, and also using that filter to sell his policies?
Well, there's been some concern about overexposure, putting the president out there too much, whether it's online, television, whatever form it might be. The White House doesn't seem overly concerned about that. They seem to feel that their best asset is the president himself. The more he can sell the American people on his proposals, whether it's the budget or revising the banking system, whatever else it might be, that's their best way to go.
He's the salesman. Okay.
That's
Thank
right.
you, David. Peter, thanks very much.
Sure.
You're watching Washington Unplugged on CBSNews.com. I'm here with Tom Toles, the Washington Post Pulitzer Prize-winning cartoonist. Tom has been skewering Washington politicians for decades, and we're here to talk about his latest victims. Tom, tell me about the new administration. How does it change versus the Bush administration in terms of your inspiration, or does it not change at all?
Well, what I do is on a day-to-day basis, so I'm looking at the news every day. Now, obviously, when the administration changes, especially this kind of historic change, it changes the entire landscape. Before, we were dealing with a familiar set of figures, very well-known personalities, very defined issues, and a history to work off of. Now everything is new. A new president tends to get a benefit of the doubt. He comes in with a mandate. He's got a lot of new stuff. So instead of cartooning about specific problems with long histories, now it's like introducing a new set of characters in a new play, a new drama, and just seeing how everything fits together and is playing out in the public.
All right, well, show us one of your recent ones from...
Okay, well, recently the last couple of weeks, I've been in the populist pitchfork carrying mode. There's a lot of debate, a lot of high feelings about the bailouts, the bonuses, Wall Street in general. And this cartoon is about public anger. It's a dinner setting with a master of the universe being served the head of a rather upset member of the public, and he's asking, why is he so angry? I think this cartoon, for me anyway, expresses that there's a legitimate and highly understandable anger, and while a lot of people question, and part of the commentary has been, well, is this really productive are these the very specific individuals? This cartoon was designed to say, yes, in the aggregate, there is something very real to be upset about.
Tell me what's happening down in the lower left-hand corner here on a lot of your cartoons. There's a little something else going on.
Well, it's just, this is a drawing of me. I'm actually larger than this drawing. It's a way to personalize and add an additional thought to the cartoon. Sometimes it amplifies, sometimes it extends, sometimes it even cuts the other way. This one, it says, he, referring to the head here, wants to put you off your feed, implying that his goal is to dampen the master's appetite for more of the same.
As you show us another one, and as you do, tell me about your inspiration. I mean, is it the front pages? Is it committee hearings? Is it?
Like everybody else in Washington, I try to read everything, watch everything, know everything. Obviously, that's impossible, but I think my job is somewhat to be a distiller. There's just so much stuff out there. There's so much commentary. There's so much factual matter that somebody needs to be. I tend to think of myself as being the one-stop shopping, the last word on an issue. After you've read everything else, then you see, well, what does this all boil down to? Now this one we've heard so much about too big to fail, and we're thinking, well, are they too big to fail? How much do we need to give them? How much do we need to accommodate their needs and desires? This one, I turned it around to be more, I thought was the more significant side of that. Small enough to fail, and it's just an ordinary person who's lost his house, lost his 401k, lost his job, and he's sitting out in the rain. Now this one, I got a phone call from a guy in Baltimore, and he went on, and it's just exactly what a cartoonist wants to hear. He said, you know, there's so much analysis, there's so much technical explanations for things. Somebody needs to get to the way the thing actually feels for real people. And that's what this one was about. And he said in particular, aside from the rain falling on the poor guy, he loved the forlorn birds on the wire. It's a little touch like that that can sometimes convey the atmosphere of an idea.
Since you do distill everything and you're poking at a lot of powerful people, has it ever gotten you in trouble? Pat Oliphant had an issue this week where the Anti-Defamation League was very outraged about one of his cartoons. Has that ever happened to you, and how do you walk that line?
A cartoonist has to push the edge a little bit. If you pull back all the time, there's no edge, there's no fire, there's no passion. For me, I have had some firestorms. For me, it's always been exactly for the wrong thing. I did a cartoon the week that Princess Diana and Mother Teresa died in the same week. Princess Diana got all the coverage. I did a cartoon contrasting the beautiful princess dying, getting all the coverage, and just an elderly woman, and gee, why was it that, why do you suppose there was this divergence in coverage? And for some reason, a phone tree or an email tree got started that somehow turned the cartoon upside down and said that the point of the cartoon was that Mother Teresa did not deserve any attention because she was elderly and unattractive. Well, I got just hammered over that one. On another cartoon, I got a letter from all 6 chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff because I did a cartoon sympathetic to the stresses the Army was under because of my portrayal of the Army as a wounded soldier. Well, again, it completely flipped the intention of the cartoon. I just was inundated with anger and annoyance, and it was misinterpreting, it was flipping the whole point of the cartoon. Now that isn't always the case. Sometimes cartoons are attacked, and rightly, for the overt intentionality that they're portraying. For me, it's been just the opposite.
Well, we'll look forward to seeing your next one in the Washington Post. Tom Toles, thank you very much for being with us. And thanks all of you for watching Washington Unplugged. We'll look forward to being with you next week here on CBSNews.com.